Hello. Welcome again to a discussion of ancient Greece. We have last time discussed Plato and his mentor or his instructor, Socrates. Today we'll talk about the third of the great philosophers of ancient Greece, Aristotle. He was the student of Plato, but he differed from Plato and gave us some new concepts. So let's spend this hour talking about this wonderful man, Aristotle, perhaps the most complete thinker the world has ever known. His mind was so organized, and everything that he looked at, every topic that he considered, he laid down fundamental principles that have come to us and in many cases are still used today. Those that aren't used today were used for many years following Aristotle's life, and only with great difficulty were they given up. So here was a man who has contributed to our civilization for literally thousands of years. Some of the areas in which he has had a special force are logic, or the area of metaphysics, that is, what is real, scientific classifications, the scientific method, scientific results in various fields, literary criticism. Now look at the big jump there. Rhetoric, or how you convince people, ethics, and politics. Let's take a look at those. Beginning with the rules of logic. There are three principal methods of logic, and they're not totally independent: syllogism, inductive logic, and deductive logic. To give you a little feeling about all three of those, let's take a look at them independently. First, syllogism. It has a particular form. Most of you, I think, are already familiar with the form of a syllogism, but let's do an example just so that you can remember. Here is the first premise of a syllogism. All trees need light. And here we see a picture of trees with the sun, and of course, that's to indicate that all trees need light. Then the second premise is an oak is a tree. And here we see an oak as a tree. And because there is a connection, the word tree or the concept of tree, between the first and the second premise, we can draw the conclusion of the syllogism, which is, therefore, oaks need light. Now let's take a look at the next method of logic. It's called inductive. Inductive is where you start with small concepts, each individually determined, and then you build up to a generalization. For instance, this dog needs lungs. That dog needs lungs. Every dog I have seen needs lungs. Therefore, we make the conclusion, all dogs need lungs. You see, we begin with individual circumstances, study many of them, and then finally draw a full conclusion. The third of our methods of logical thinking is deductive. Let's begin with a similar example, except now we start with the generalization. All dogs have lungs. Therefore, this dog has lungs. This method, which is derived strongly from reasoning and thinking about the first premise, is the method that Aristotle favored in most of his logical writing. Now, let's talk about metaphysics. What is real? In this case, Aristotle took his starting point from his mentor and teacher, Plato. Plato, of course, defined the form, and he said the form is that inner essence of things that is characteristic of things of that class. So all chairs have chairness, all people have humanness, and perhaps all things of any kind have a form that represents what they are. So Aristotle could ask the question, what is the form of humans? But he added a concept. What is the end or the purpose of humans? And this is a contribution that Aristotle gave to us that has tremendous meaning in thinking about the purpose of things. So here's the answer for Aristotle. What is the form or purpose or end of humans? He says, all human beings by nature desire to know. Now this may be reflective of his own nature and those around him because they were constantly on a quest for knowledge. But it's an interesting concept. All human beings by nature desire to know. Now I'd like to give you a slightly unusual connection. Look at the Book of Mormon and consider the scripture, man is that he might have joy. And if we think of joy as progress or increasing in knowledge, all human beings desire to know, and man is that he might have joy or progress or increases in knowledge, have a very strong similarity. Maybe there's some relationship in the truth behind both of these statements. Aristotle also looked at forms as saying all things consist of form and matter. If you like, we can think of that roughly as spirit and matter. But then he went one step further and he said creativity could be thought of as form and matter. If we make vision, that is the creative vision, similar to form, and effort, that is the work that we do, similar to matter. So what we are saying here is that as form is to matter, vision is to effort. I grant that it's a somewhat subtle connection, but a very interesting one. And look at what President Monson had to say about that feature for us, that connection. Vision without effort is daydreaming. Effort without vision is drudgery. But vision coupled with effort will obtain the prize, in my words, and be creative. Now, let's talk about the great scientific contribution of Aristotle. He gave us a scientific classification. He looked around the world, saw similarities and grouped things together in similarities, and then he separated them out into a very complex system. And he did that for physics, chemistry, biology, other sciences as well. The one that's most familiar to us is the one in biology, where we have a species and a genus and a family and an order and a class and so on. And each of these get bigger and bigger as they go up. This classification system was given to us by Aristotle. It shows the very, very logical and well-ordered mind that Aristotle brought to his work. Now, he gave us, in addition to this classification system, he gave us a method of doing science, if we like, a scientific method. It's not the scientific method that we use today. That was invented about the early part of the 17th century. But from the time of Aristotle until the 17th century, practically 2,000 years later, we see that his method was the method that was used for science. Well, if it dominated the world for 2,000 years, we ought to try and understand it and see if there is something in his method that we can learn from. So let's talk about what this method was. First of all, the basic assumption was on reasoning, and the reasoning method that he preferred, as we've already said, was the deductive system. So he would conceive of the generality, justify the generality through logic, and then from that generality he would draw specifics. He also said that when we draw those generalities and look at the specifics as well, we do a kind of observation of the world around us. But he cautioned, never do experimentation. Experimentation is a distortion of the natural world, a holding of certain things constant in an artificial way and then letting one variable change. We think of that as common science today. Aristotle was absolutely against it. He said that when we artificially hold nature in a particular way, we really don't understand nature. and therefore he said you cannot do experimentation, you can only do observations. Within that context, let's now follow the 4 steps in the Aristotelian scientific method. A couple of bases first before we do that. He did believe that there were 4 elements of the earth. These were conceived long before Aristotle, but he took them, amplified them, enriched them. And therefore, the 4 elements are earth, air, fire, and water. And then he said, those are the elements of earth, but there is another element for all things above the earth, at the extralunar level, from the moon out. And then he said, all of those heavenly bodies are made of a 5th element. And he called it the quintessence, or the 5th essence. So looking in detail at those 4 elements, we see that they can also be associated with 4 natural fluids within the body. Now we see how Aristotle's method was related to human beings and adapted to the medical profession. Let's think about each one of these. Blood is given an analogy to fire and is thought of as being hot and moist. Phlegm is given an analogy to the brain and is moist and cold. Black bile is given an analogy to the spleen or the kidneys, and it is thought of as being cold and dry. And finally, yellow bile is thought of as being associated with the liver, and it is dry and hot. And each one of those is associated with, in its turn, fire, earth, water, and air. And health comes when all of these humors, they are called, are in proper balance. All of these bodily fluids are in proper balance. And we understand that medicine adopted this concept and practiced it for many, many years, even up until the 19th century, because when people got hot and sweaty, that meant that they had too much of the blood, too much of the fire-like element, and therefore they had to get rid of some of the blood when they were hot and sweaty. And the way they did that, of course, is to bleed a person to try and get rid of some of the blood. So we see that this concept of Aristotle and the linkage to medicine continued for certainly more than 2,000 years. Now let's discuss the 4 causal questions that introduce the method by which Aristotle would look at all of these. And the 4 questions are, first, the material question. The question that we ask is, what is this thing made of? Second, the efficient question. Don't be confused by that name. What it really means is, what caused it? How did it come into being? The third is the formal question, and this you must remember that Aristotle believed, as did Plato, that everything had a form. And so the question here is, what is its form or essence? And the 5th question is simply the final question. What is its purpose? Now, in science today, we don't think about what is its purpose. We look at the other 3, the material and what caused it and what might be its form, but we don't think about what its final purpose would be. And because these are all a little bit strange, let's do a couple of examples. Here's the first. A mouse. Well, we say, what is a mouse's material? Today, we'll give kind of a modern answer. It's molecules. A mouse is made out of molecules. How did it come to pass? What is the efficiency, or what is the method of its coming to being? And we would say, well, biological birth. What is its form? And here's a very interesting point. Its form is DNA. And we think of DNA as information about the cells and molecules of that little creature. And finally, we say, what is its purpose? I'm not sure what the purpose of a mouse is. I don't think Aristotle would have known. But we might say that the final purpose of a mouse is to fulfill its purpose as a creature of God. I think that might be a good answer. Let's do another one. Here is a beautiful sculpture of the discus thrower. What is its material? Marble. How did it come to be? Well, it came to be because a sculptor, a man named Myron, sculpted it. What is its form? Well, we look at it and see that the form is a discus thrower. And finally, what is its purpose? That's a very interesting question. We wonder, maybe it was money. He wanted to make a sale. Maybe it was art, just for art's sake. Maybe it was a seeking of perfection because the ancient Greeks, especially the artists, strove for perfection in their lives, and that was one of the motivators for what they did. We're not sure of all of those, but it is an interesting procedure to ask those questions, and we can see that Aristotle's 4 questions would have led to a tremendous increase in knowledge as people examined the world around them and asked these questions to try and come to answers. So we can now ask, what is different between Aristotle's scientific method and the modern scientific method? And let's just name a few of those. No experimentation for Aristotle. He did ask the final question, which we don't ask today. He also was interested in classification, probably more than individual knowledge about each creature beyond the 4 questions, but still there's some similarities. One interesting point is how Aristotle treated motion, and that caused a lot of problems for people when science was reawakened in a new way in the 17th century. Let's take a look at Aristotelian motion concepts. He said, bodies move to achieve their stable or natural position as determined by the type of material they are made of. Therefore, if it's made of dirt or earth, its natural position would be downward toward the earth, and things made of earth would fall if they are not touching the earth, if they are not in their natural position. Secondly, water. Water also falls in its natural movement. Fire, on the other hand, naturally rises, as does air. And if there is something that is made up of a mixture of these, then it kind of behaves as the average, whatever is the greatest of all of those when averaged together. When there is more of a basic material in something, then it follows the path of that basic material. Well, that's very interesting because according to those rules, then things that are heavy and had therefore more basic material, let's say dirt, then they would fall faster than something that had a lesser amount. But we see that that is not true, and that was one of the points that Galileo made when he dropped the stones from the Tower of Pisa, assuming that that story is real. Now, let's look at Aristotle and his literary criticism capabilities. He loved the plays, and he went to see the plays of the Greeks in Athens. There he identified several characteristics that were critical to be analyzed in determining whether or not it is a good play. Many of those we continue to analyze today in trying to decide if a play or a movie is good. Let's just list them. The plot, the characters, the thought behind it, the diction and how it is said and portrayed, the melodic element. Very interesting point. We now believe that many of the plays, if not all of them, had major melodic components, and some people believe that they were entirely sung. So for Aristotle to say the melodic content would give us cause to think that that would be true. Maybe we would think of these ancient plays as more like operas, or perhaps in today's world, they could even be like Broadway musicals. The next would be the spectacle. And it was important in Greek plays to have huge spectacles. They actually had machines that would come down and move the actors around, and the actors would fly into the air. So the spectacles that we see in Broadway plays or in operas would be typical also of the Greek plays, although I suppose not as elaborate as we have today. And then there is a concept called catharsis. Catharsis is a healing or a changing, an inner resolution of things. And the way in which the Greek play was able to bring about this catharsis was an important element in deciding whether or not the play was good. In Aristotle's feelings, the very best playwright was Sophocles. And I think we'd have to agree that he certainly was an important and perhaps the best of the Greek playwrights. Now let's talk about Aristotle's concepts of rhetoric. That is, how do you convince someone to believe you? He lists 3 different methods of appeal. That is, 3 different ways that you appeal to an audience. The first of those methods is called ethos. Ethos means that the audience has trust with the speaker, and that there is a connection between the speaker and the audience through that trust. An example of this might be President Monson. He speaks at conference, we hear him, we trust him, and we want to do what he has said. Another was President Hinckley. I remember very distinctly when President Hinckley asked everyone in the church to read the Book of Mormon, and it was September and he wanted us to finish before the end of the year. I did it. Many, many others did it. And we did it because of ethos, the trust that we have that the person speaking can be believed and that we should follow what they say. Now let's talk about the second of the methods of appeal, and that's pathos. Pathos has to do with emotion. So the person who is speaking must give emotion to us. They must appeal to our heart. Where the first one, we trusted the character of the speaker and they appeal to our soul. In this case, we trust the emotions that that person who is speaking brings out in our hearts. A good example would be Patrick Henry. When he rose in the House of Burgess in colonial Virginia and said, "Give me liberty or give me death," it stirred the hearts of the patriots, and they went out and fought the War of Independence. So, as you can see, Patrick Henry was a person who used pathos as his method of appeal. The third of these methods of appeal is logos, that is, the mind or reasoning. This has to do with logic and, of course, is an appeal to the brain. It's probably the least persuasive for action of the 3 methods of appeal, but it has a strong residual action because people can keep thinking of it. If there is an appeal to a person's heart, the heart might wane in its enthusiasm, but the mind can keep working on it. A good example of an appeal to logos would be, for instance, a presidential debate, where the candidates would talk back and forth and try and appeal to our reasoning as a method of convincing us to vote for them. So here are the 3 methods: ethos, pathos, logos. Appeal to the soul, to the heart, and to the brain. Well, Aristotle continued to investigate appeals to emotions and appeals to our logic and appeals to our soul. And he tried to figure out why we're motivated to take certain actions. In his typical logical way, he enumerated various motivations for action. Here we can see that one motivation is pleasure. But he said pleasure is that motive that is the goal of the vulgar man. Now, don't think too harshly about the word vulgar. It doesn't mean a bad man, it means a common man. So the common man is motivated by pleasure. There is a higher motivation. That is to be motivated by honor. And honor appeals to the cultivated man. So there's the common man and the cultivated man. But then, somewhat surprisingly, Aristotle goes one step further, and he says that there is yet another motivation for behavior, and that is to be motivated by true principles based on truth and virtue. Those true principles and that motivation is the highest form of motivation and comes from contemplation and philosophy and would be the person who is the highest level of civilization. It's a very interesting concept, and I think one that fits very well within LDS standards and beliefs. Well, where does that lead a person in their actions? One caution that Aristotle makes is that we should avoid extremes. Now, he doesn't mean by this that you should avoid the extreme of never killing someone or always killing someone, so that the middle ground is kill someone once in a while. No, that's not what he meant. What he meant is that we need to try and find the mean in some behavioral situation. Let me give you an example, and maybe that will illustrate. Let's take the concept of courage. The golden mean means that the person who has courage acts in a courageous way. They act forthrightly, they act with some bravery. But let's see what the two extremes are, the things that must be avoided. On one end is cowardice. That means that you have too little courage. You're afraid of the dark, you're afraid of shadows, you're afraid of all kinds of things. On the other end, and many people think that cowardice and courage are opposites, but Aristotle identified rashness as the other end. He says this is having too much enthusiasm for doing something. Not courage, but rashness is the opposite of cowardice. An interesting concept, and again, one that fits, I think, in LDS thinking. He says, Aristotle, in describing how we should behave, for both excessive and insufficient exercise destroy one's strength, and both eating and drinking too much or too little destroy health, whereas the right quantity produces, increases, or preserves it. So it is the same with temperance, courage, and other virtues. In all our conduct, it is the mean that is to be commended. And he called it the golden mean. Well, Aristotle was also involved in politics. He and his students went out and studied 158 constitutions or modes of government. And he compared them. He brought them in, and in Aristotle's typical way, he categorized them and organized them for our benefit. His mind was just marvelous. Here we can see the distillation of all of those 158 different cases. He identified rule by three different types of entities. The first, a single person. The second, a small group. And the third, a large group. And then he identified a stable form of government and an unstable form for each of those. Here we see that a single person, the stable form, is called a monarchy. The unstable form is a despot. In a case of a small group, the stable form is called an aristocracy, and the unstable form is called an oligarchy. Oligarchy usually meaning a negative control by a small group. In the case of a ruler, being a large group, the stable form is called a polity, or a group with a constitution that governs how they handle things. The unstable form, interestingly enough, is called a democracy, or as he would characterize it, mob rule. Therefore, Aristotle was not in favor of democracy according to this definition because it means mob rule, or everybody gets a vote and nobody has any boundaries within which they have to cast that ballot and make the government work. No, he favored a polity, that is a constitution. This may have come from the fact that it was the Athenian democracy that killed Socrates, and Aristotle would have remembered that terrible event in Athenian history. Well, we've talked about Aristotle, and previously we talked about Plato. I think it's appropriate to take a moment and compare the two. First of all, Plato and Aristotle. All philosophies are just footnotes of these two men. By and large, that has been said by those who are philosophers and studied their works. They were, to say the least, tremendously comprehensive. They have become the basis of Western civilization in three different areas. First, philosophy, obviously. Second, religion. Third, science. Philosophy we understand. Science, we've already talked about the contribution to science of Aristotle. Let me talk about religion for just a moment now, and we'll talk about it later in a future lecture. Religion, especially the Christian religion, has been strongly influenced by the teachings of Plato and Aristotle. When we talked about Plato, we discussed the definition of God and perfection, and we saw that his definition led to a definition of God as something that is without body parts and passions. Most of the Christian world, with the exception of the LDS faith, believe in a God without body parts and passions. Therefore, we can see the tremendous influence of Plato, and to some extent also Aristotle, on that concept of religion. Well, in the Renaissance, the great painters and sculptors and thinkers were trying to recapture some of the glory of the ancient Greek and Roman past. One of the most beautiful paintings of the Renaissance is a fresco that is inside the Vatican. It's in the Pope's private chambers, and it was done by Raphael. Here we see this beautiful painting. It's called School of Athens. And at the center of the School of Athens, we see two figures. One, a man with a long beard, and he is pointing upward. This man is meant to represent Plato. The face on the man, we are told, is the face of Leonardo da Vinci. The other man next to him, standing at the center, has his hand downward, thrust toward the ground. That man, we are told, represents Aristotle. And so Plato would be seemingly say, truth comes from above, from the forms, from our understanding of the forms. Whereas Aristotle would say, truth comes from our observation of the world and our investigation of the forms that are in the world around us. Here we can see other names of representative people who were put into this famous painting by Raphael. He put himself in, but he also put in people like Heraclitus, Euclid, Ptolemy, Zoroaster, and others that we have already discussed in previous lectures. It's a marvelous painting, and when you go to the Vatican, you should make sure that you see it. It is in the last room that you go into before you descend a small staircase into the Sistine Chapel. A marvelous, marvelous thing to do. So now, Plato versus Aristotle, what do we see? In the case of Plato, we see that the particular was less real, that the general was more important. In Aristotle, he said that the universe was less real, that the particular that could be observed was more real. In the case of Plato, he says substance, that is the physical nature of things, is merely transitory. Whereas in Aristotle, he believed that substance needs matter, and it is therefore much more permanent than Plato would say. In the case of Plato, he says the form is static. That is, the form of a chair is always the form of a chair. Aristotle believed that forms change, and they have within them an element of change. For instance, the form of an oak tree, at one stage of its development, is actually an acorn. And that would be consistent with Aristotle's view of this changing nature of forms. In the case of Plato, he would say that a form could not change, whereas we've already said that change is inevitable to progress, and that in fact progress is an important element of life in the world of Aristotle. Plato founded a school. It was called the Academy. Aristotle went to the Academy, but he broke with the Academy after the death of Plato, and he founded his own school, and it was called the Lyceum. So we see a competition in Athens between these two schools that later formed the basis of what today we would call universities. In the case of Plato, he belittled natural science. In the case of Aristotle, he was an observer of natural science, yea, an inventor of natural science. And in the case of Plato, he believed that math was the highest form of thinking, and in Aristotle's view, he separated math from science and observation. So, what is the summary of Greek philosophy? What's its importance in our lives today? One concept that we get out of Greek philosophy is that the world is basically rational, that we can understand it. It is the basis of science, given to us by Thales. It is the basis of logic, given to us by Aristotle. Science and philosophy can find truth. Those are concepts brought to us by these great Greek philosophers. Secondly, they said the world can be understood by identifying the fundamentals, those basic things that lie at the heart of everything. They said fundamentals do not change, and the perfect things are unchanging. So now, ask yourself the question, has the world been helped or hurt by Greek philosophy? They've made some mistakes. They've caused some problems. Science was probably impeded for many, many years from finding some truths because of the Aristotelian scientific method. On the other hand, it may have found a whole bunch of other truths because people used the Aristotelian method to investigate the world around them. Philosophy may have arrived at some wonderful truths that would not have been known were it not for Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Yet, sadly, even in the world today, we see that philosophy, according to these men, has led to error and some problems in life. So I think we would have to say that, as with most other things, invented by men and understood by men, it has good and it has bad. We must be able to separate the two. I think it's interesting that we could look at them from a particular point of view, and rather than give an LDS point of view, I'd like to give a Jewish point of view, an ancient Jewish point of view. A man who lived during the Roman times and wrote a book about his own religion and about the world around him. And this man's name was Josephus. Josephus said, "I cannot but greatly wonder at those who think that we must attend to none but the Greeks and learn the truth from them only, and that we are not to believe ourselves or other men. Indeed, they admit themselves that it is the Egyptians, the Chaldeans, and the Phoenicians, for I will not now include ourselves, Jews, among these, that have preserved the memory of the most ancient and lasting tradition." So according to Josephus, we should not depend solely on the Greeks, especially on their philosophy, but rather we should look to other civilizations and other peoples and appreciate the truths that they have given to us by their own methods. In the end, we ought to appreciate what Plato and today Aristotle in today's lecture have given. We should be informed about what they have done. Thank you very much.